For the purpose of this video, even though it has a handful of definitions, we're going to define energy as what enables life and living conditions. Much of history and throughout the agrarian era, wood, when ignited, was the fuel that warmed our bodies and allowed us to cook and fill our bellies. Wood was the fuel of the past, but as the industrial era emerged in the 18th century, it was discovered that while steam engines could run on wood, coal was preferable as an energy source. Because a ton of coal produced 4 times the amount of energy as a ton of wood. Coal wasn't the only ballgame in town, as it was discovered that whale oil, when rendered from the blubber of these mammals, could illuminate lamps, extending day into night. Whaling was reportedly the 5th largest industry in the United States by the 1850s. And oceans quickly became overfished and depleted. American whale hunting fleets were halted during the Civil War, but after the war, most didn't return to whaling. Instead, they shifted to a new energy source, the one we know today. While the first discovery of black gold was reportedly by the Chinese in 600 BC, it wasn't until the late 1850s that oil was unearthed in Pennsylvania, and eventually Texas. A few years later, John D. Rockefeller formed Standard Oil, and his big oil operation swiftly dominated American oil refineries and pipelines. ExxonMobil is what we now know Standard Oil as today. Meanwhile, the Rothschild banking family sought control of Russia's oil during this time and commissioned a British trader to expand their oil empire. And eventually this affair was dubbed Shell Transport and Trading, which later merged with Royal Dutch Petroleum. And that's the Frankenstein oil baby we now know as Royal Dutch Shell. The British government got in on the action too, when they purchased a controlling share of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company that would eventually become known as BP, milking Iran's oil fields at the beginning of the 1900s, supplying oil for the Royal Navy in the years leading up to the First World War. Countries with access to copious amounts of oil clearly had a strategic advantage in the world wars that followed. And not only that, but countries with oil became a major geopolitical prize in the aftermath of war. And I say all of this to demonstrate that the original oil monopolies were only 3 families. Families who controlled the lion's share of the world's oil, or we could even say the world's energy, for much of the 20th century. In 1908, Henry Ford introduced the Model T to America, an affordable automobile for a middle-class budget. His Model T could run off of oil-based gasoline and corn-based ethanol. And while the advent of the affordable automobile increased the demand for gasoline, it was rivaled by ethanol. Corn-based ethanol could be made by any old farmer by taking the kernels of corn, grinding them up into a flour or mash, extracting the sugars, then fermenting, distilling, and dehydrating the mixture. In a statement Ford gave to a New York Times reporter, he said, "The fuel of the future is going to come from fruit, like that sumac out by the road, or from apples, weeds, sawdust, almost anything. There is fuel in every bit of vegetable matter that can be fermented. There's enough alcohol in 1 year's yield of an acre of potatoes to drive the machinery necessary to cultivate the fields for 100 years. I mean, can you imagine being self-reliant for energy just from what you can grow on your own land? Or being able to purchase fuel from within your own community? No? Me either. If I were to ask you why Prohibition went into effect in the United States from 1920 to 1933, how would you answer? We're told that the national prohibition of alcohol manufacturing, transport, and sales was mainly attributed to religious organizations in their belief that alcohol consumption led to the destruction of the family and contributed to crime rates across the country. However, it's curious because despite its influence in world wars that a ton of people died in, as well as my ability to travel from point A to point B, and my freedom to drown my sorrows in an effort to forget all those things, I don't remember learning much about big oil in my high school or college history classes. Strange. Reported in the New York Times, the Anti-Saloon League received over $500,000 from John D. Rockefeller to help spearhead the Prohibition movement. To put that into perspective, $500,000 in 1915 is the equivalent of over $12 million in today's money. Once Prohibition was enacted, it was not only illegal for people to purchase alcoholic beverages, but it made it illegal to purchase or manufacture any kind of alcohol, which included ethanol, meaning it became a crime for farmers to easily distill their own fuel, and instead they were to depend on a gas supply. What a coincidence, right? Henry Ford created an automobile that a middle-class family could afford, and it was able to run on fuel that a middle-class family could make themselves if needed. And suddenly, that became illegal to do, and over the next decade, mafia families rose to power. A foreign banking system took hold of the United States monetary system. Another world war occurred, which, among other things, yielded in more oil territory for a handful of families to pillage. And here we are, after all this time, sucking the teat of the United States Incorporated. These coincidences work in such mysterious ways, don't they, internet friends? Here's where Stanley Meyer gets his time to shine. A perfect storm was brewing after automobile ownership and electric light bulb usage became commonplace, and the oil market began to shift from Big Oil's seven sisters plundering oil-rich nations for their resources to oil-rich nations forming the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, otherwise known as OPEC, in 1960. OPEC aimed to manage the oil supply in an effort to set the price of oil on the world market. So, in other words, these oil exporting countries like Iraq, Iran, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait all set a price on a regular and steady supply of petroleum to consuming nations. Understandably, the leaders of these oil-producing countries wanted to assert control over their country's own oil. But the problem was that these prices set for oil were often way higher than what countries like the United States were used to paying, therefore seen as a threat to its energy supply. Despite all this, most oil transactions were based around the petrodollar, the unit of currency earned by a country for the export of petroleum. And since, historically, global transactions involve the US dollar, the petrodollar system afforded the United States, or really, its bankers, global hegemony or influence over the oil industry, which has completely shaped America's foreign policy in the Middle East. Meanwhile, Stanley was watching all of this go down and thought to himself, you know what, this totally sucks, big time. So Stanley put together a solution. His work on converting water into fuel began in 1975, 1 year after the Arab oil embargo, which resulted in high gas prices, long lines at the pump, and general anxiety over the future of oil availability. Stanley was one of two twin brothers who grew up in Ohio. Upon return from his military service, Stanley worked for the Battelle Foundation, a nonprofit which notably developed the first nuclear fuel rods for nuclear reactors and other technology for the United States space program. Stanley also had roots at NASA, having worked on the Gemini project. So Stanley wasn't some bumpkin in Ohio gluing macaroni to construction paper in his garage. He was the real deal. He began working with his brother Stephen, a former electrical engineer, and together they built an operation which was valued at several $1 million, focusing on the field of transportation and transport equipment. At one point, Stanley was awarded Inventor of the Year by the Who's Who of America. Side note, both Stanley and his twin brother are giving me major Operation Paperclip vibes between all the Smarty Pants twin stuff and working on the Gemini project. But I'll reserve my Warner Von Braun and Disney jokes for later, as we've got water-powered cars to cover over here. This was the whole origin story of Stanley patenting the water fuel cell, the basis of which revolved around an automobile being retrofitted with his cell contraption, and that cell allowed the engine to use water instead of gasoline as fuel. By splitting water into its component elements, hydrogen and oxygen, hydrogen was burned to generate energy. Stanley demonstrated this process, and eyewitness accounts included a chemist from the United Kingdom, a former controller of the British Navy, and the dean of engineering at Mary College. They all agreed that Stanley's invention could do what physicists said was impossible: efficiently turn water into hydrogen fuel. Enough for Stanley to drive his dune buggy across country on 20 gallons of water straight from the faucet. After 20 years of tinkering with the water fuel cell, Stanley and his brother finally met up with various investors in an effort to get the invention into the public sphere. On March 20th, 1998, at the Grove City, Ohio Cracker Barrel, Stephen and Stanley sat down with two Belgian investors. On the hierarchy of American breakfast chains, I'd have to rank Cracker Barrel at the top. while IHOP would be somewhere at the very bottom and Waffle House smack dab in the middle, because every time I think of Waffle House, I think of FEMA camps, and I don't personally find that as a preference. But my favorite thing to order at Cracker Barrel is eggs in a basket, not a ticket to the afterlife, which Stanley apparently ordered as he took a sip of his cranberry juice after toasting to future business endeavors with these investors. According to his brother Steven, after taking a sip of his drink, Stanley grabbed his neck, fled from the table, and stumbled outside to the parking lot, where he spoke his last words to his brother, saying, "They poisoned me." Stanley was in his mid-50s when he took his last breath, which the coroner attributed to a brain aneurysm on the official report, not poisoning. I can't tell you how many brain aneurysm stories I've read where the afflicted party shouts they've been poisoned before kicking the bucket. When Stanley's brother told the Belgian investors of his passing the next day, they didn't say much, didn't seem to care, and just shrugged and left. A 3-month investigation by Grove City Police followed, but not much came of it. Word of Stanley's legal troubles spread, detailing his unfulfilled promises to investors while he was still among the living. And eventually, Stanley's living reputation as a visionary transformed to a fraudster post-mortem. It seemed like Stanley's water fuel cell invention was buried with him, because after his death, his invention got little traction, mainly just ridicule. Critics of Stanley claim that he had no official scientific background and was nothing more than a con man, whose water-powered car was fueled by money from investors, not water. Critics claim that we don't have water-powered cars after all this time because they don't work and never did. They claim that rumors of his murder are nothing more than conspiracy, and that his story lives on because all us chumps are emotionally enthralled by the prospect of an underdog standing up to the unseen forces of the New World Order. No, Stanley's naysayers claim that Stanley died of a brain aneurysm, as the coroner's report suggests, because of his high blood pressure, which his haters attribute to the stress that he was under due to all the scheming he was up to. But followers of his work took his dying words as truth and believed him to be murdered. But if he was murdered, why? Because Big Oil couldn't handle people being able to get fuel from their kitchen sink? It's not like they can carry out a prohibition of tap water. Since Stanley's patents have long expired, his inventions are now in the public domain. If Stanley's naysayers claim that he was just a fraud, why have vehicle manufacturers created a very similar car in recent years? Even the United States Navy is getting in on the action, having developed the technology to extract carbon dioxide from seawater while producing hydrogen to fuel their vessels. They just had to wait long enough to figure out how to profit from it. We all know they withhold technologies from the public until a predetermined date, releasing the technology on their own terms. My first episode of Losers History had to be on Stanley, because this whole story on the surface appears to be about oil. But if you take a step back and look, it's really about control. Who has it and who is kept from having any? This control extends from the wars we fight under false pretenses, to the micromanagement of our daily routines, from the air we breathe to the food we eat, to the information they force young children to recite in the classrooms. Do you think, after a lifetime of being told to raise your hand to ask permission to use the restroom, and being forced to memorize absolute garbage for the sole purpose of filling in bubbles on a Scantron, that any child coming up through the public school education system is gonna be the next Nikola Tesla or Stanley Meyer, looking for ways to innovate, improve, and escape the clutches of those who manufacture our reality, and ultimately, our consent? Can y'all tell that I'm personally offended by the idea of having to raise your hand to go to the potty? I swear I managed to work that into every video like it's my personal crusade. So what do you think, internet friends? Was Stanley Meyer murdered for standing up to Big Oil? Is there something to be learned from his mistakes? I was 10 minutes into researching this video when PBS, the United States Public Broadcasting Service funded by the federal government, went out of their way to tell me the entire history of Big Oil was written by Big Oil. And I have to ask, what else is written by Big Oil? The 6 o'clock news? I hope you enjoyed the very first installation of Losers History.